Welcome to this week's edition of Reading the Gospels Through Hebrew Eyes. We're going to spend some time in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5:21 and following today. And we're going to talk about how Jesus takes several of the Ten Commandments as well as some other material from the Torah, and he demonstrates how a surface reading of these commandments is not enough. So sometimes these are called an antitheses, where Jesus says, you've heard that it was said, but I say to you, as if he's setting up a contrast. It's not a contrast. What's happening is Jesus is going to intensify these commandments. He's going to amplify them, as it were. He's going to dig into exactly what the full implications of all these commandments are. So as you hear each of these, don't hear Jesus, as it were, saying, you've heard the Bible says this, but I'm saying to you that. Not the case. The Son of God is the one who spoke the Ten Commandments to the Israelites from Mount Sinai. And now the Son of God in his incarnation is clarifying the full extent and the proper interpretation of these Ten Commandments to his followers in the Sermon on the Mount. So keep that in mind. He's not, as it were, setting up a contrast, but he is intensifying and in some cases interiorizing these commandments in order that he might plumb the full depths of what God requires of us, not just in our deeds, and not just in our words, but in our thoughts and desires as well. Okay, so that's the first thing. And then also keep in mind the Moses typology that's going on throughout the Sermon on the Mount. We've talked before about how the figure of Moses, what he did, what he suffered, how he taught, all of that provides somewhat of a paradigm for the ministry of Jesus. He's not just a second Moses. He's not just a second lawgiver, but Moses does set the type of the pattern, the blueprint for much of the ministry of Jesus. And just like you had Moses connected with Mount Sinai and the giving of the law, now you have Jesus on a mountaintop, clarifying, intensifying, interiorizing what Moses received from God on that mountain. And then also notice how Jesus, when he speaks, doesn't speak as a prophet does. He doesn't speak certainly as a teacher of the law speaks. Rather, he speaks as God. He says, you've heard that it was said, that is to say, you've heard God spoke in his Torah this, and now I, as one who possesses divine authority, I as the one sent by the Father, I as the Son of God, am now saying to you this. So keep in mind the Moses typology, that Jesus is not, as it were, setting aside part of the law, but he's plumbing the depths of it. And also that Jesus is speaking here with divine authority. So those are three important things to keep in mind as we dive into the text itself. So we're going to start out with Matthew 5, and we're going to begin with verse 21. But as we do, I want you to keep in mind that the text that we're going to be covering, the text that's going to be read on Sunday, only is going to cover a portion of the six statements, six antitheses, so-called. And these six are this. So you've heard that it was said to those of old, but I say to you, and that one's about murder. The second one is, you've heard that it was said, but that's about adultery. Third, it was also said, but this one's about divorce. Fourth, again, you have heard that it was said to those of old, but, and that one's about swearing. Fifth, you've heard that it was said, but, and that's about the kind of the eye for eye, the lex talionis passage. And then six, you've heard that it was said, but, and that's about loving your neighbor. And unfortunately, the text does not include all of those from Matthew chapter 5. It only is going to take us through the first four of those. But keep in mind, there are six of these so-called antitheses, which I would really call six intensifications in Matthew 5:21 to 48. So, getting into the text itself, Matthew 5:21 and 22. You have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council. And whoever says, you fool, will be liable to the hell of fire. Well, let's clarify some of this language. We'll take a look at some of the Greek that's behind it. So first of all, I want you to notice the parallel here between, you've heard that it was said, you shall not murder. And if you are, what happens? You will be liable to judgment. That same exact Greek phrase is used with one who is angry. So that one who is angry with his brother will also be liable to judgment. So Jesus sets up a situation here where whether you are externally murdering someone or interiorly on the inside angry with them, it's the same. The same penalty is what you deserve, the judgment. Also, not just kind of this emotion, this desire of anger, but the way it's expressed verbally. And we have a couple of different ways that is described. So the ESV has whoever insults his brother. Literally in the Greek, it's whoever says to him, raka. We'll talk about that in a minute. Probably means just something like empty head. It's an Aramaic insult. So whoever says to him, raka, will be liable to the council. Now, in the Greek, that's the Sanhedrin. Could be the kind of the Jewish Supreme Court, if you will, that Sanhedrin, perhaps local councils or local courts. Either way, that one who insults his brother is liable to judgment in the form of the council. And similarly, whoever says you fool will be liable to the hell of fire. Now, in Greek, that's talking about Gehenna. And Gehenna is Gehenna has a kind of interesting background. It comes from the name of an actual place. So, Ge Hinnom, which is the valley of Hinnom. Ge is a valley. Hinnom is someone's name. This is a place right outside Jerusalem. And over time, throughout the Old Testament, it was kind of the place where a lot of really horrendous idolatry took place, including the sacrificing of children. And so Jeremiah talks about this place is going to be just a place full of bloodshed. So Ge Hinnom, the valley of Hinnom, in Hebrew comes into Greek as Gehenna. So what was just originally a geographical location outside of Jerusalem came to be symbolic of the place of punishment. So Gehenna, which is usually translated then as hell in the New Testament. But that's the background of it from the Hebrew. So let's talk a minute about these two insults that Jesus talks about. First of all, raka, which is, again, an Aramaic insult. Probably, it just means empty, probably something like empty head, something along those lines. And then moros is a word that's translated here as fool. At least that's the way that most people take it. I've got a note down there from the NET Bible First Edition notes, which says the meaning of the term moros is somewhat disputed. Most take it to mean, following the Syriac versions, you fool, although some have argued that it represents a transliteration into Greek of the Hebrew term more, which means rebel, from Deuteronomy 21. But most people think that it simply refers to an insult that means fool. So in all these cases, what's going on is that Jesus is saying, listen, this commandment about murder, it's not just prohibiting you, picking up a gun or a knife and going and killing your neighbor because you're mad at him. What is prohibited is not just the external action, but what is prohibited is anything that conflicts with the love of your neighbor. Whether that is anger in the heart, whether that is the speech that is used to express your anger, so kind of a verbal murder, if you will, or an emotional murder, all of these fall under this commandment. So you see what Jesus is doing. He's demonstrating the full ramifications of the commandment, you shall not murder. So guess what? You're a murderer. I'm a murderer. Every single person who's lived, with the exception of Jesus, has committed murder because we've all harbored hatred or anger in our hearts against our brother. We've all uttered these angry words against our neighbor. So whether in deed or whether in thought or whether in desire, whatever it is, all of that is a breaking of the commandment. So what Jesus is doing, again, he's making sure that we cannot escape from these commandments. We can't go around saying, oh yeah, I've kept most of the commandments, or I've kept one of the commandments. No, you have not. You've broken them all. So the wagging finger of accusation from the law is in our face constantly. The law cannot be kept by us. It doesn't mean that we stop trying. It doesn't mean that we don't try in every way possible to be obedient to what God has said to us. But it also instills in us an awareness that law that is requiring so much of us cannot be kept by us as sinners. And so there's a constant call to repentance because there's a constant breaking of the law in one form or fashion. So the Sermon on the Mount is revealing just how much the law requires and just how much we haven't kept it. So throughout these examination of the commandments, what we're going to see is a microscope being held up to the human heart. And the more powerful that microscope is, so the more intensely we look at what the law requires and we look at our own human hearts, the more we're going to see the evil that's there, the rebellion that's there, all the myriad ways in which these commandments are broken. Okay, so that's where we're starting. That's where we're starting out. Let's see what else we have to say. So Jesus goes on in Matthew 5:23-26 to say, so if you're offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you. Now notice the language it's used. You don't remember that you have something against your brother. This is like something that just comes to mind. Oh, yeah, I remember. I'd forgotten, but now I remember that my brother has something against me. Well, what do? You don't say, well, I'll take care of it later. No, Jesus says, you leave your gift there before the altar and go. It's kind of an awkward situation. You got your lamb or you got your doves and you're bringing them to the temple in Jerusalem. You're stepping before the priest. And then all of a sudden in your mind, you're like, oh, I totally forgot about what I'd done to my brother. And you, as it were, just leave the lamb. You drop the doves. Whatever it is, you leave it there and you go. First be reconciled. First be reconciled to your brother and then come and offer your gift. Don't worship and then be reconciled. Be reconciled and then worship. And then he adds, come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are going with him to court, lest your accuser hand you over to the judge and the judge to the guard, and you be put in prison. Truly I say to you, you will never get out until you have paid the last quadrantes, which is translated here as penny. It's 1/64th of a day's wages. A day's wages was a denarius, so this is a tiny amount, the last little bit, the quadrantes. So what's going on here is just another way of Jesus taking the commandment about murder, and here he's applying it in a positive sort of way. So the commandment is not simply prohibiting you from killing someone in thought or word or deed or desire, but also it's requiring of you, this commandment to not do something is also requiring you to do something. Will be reconciled to your brother. God is not interested in your worship if you're not reconciled to your brother. So leave your gift there at the altar, first be reconciled to your brother, and then you can come back and offer that gift. And he uses also the example of being reconciled to someone along the way. So do everything within your power to be on friendly terms, to be on reconciled terms with those who are around you. So not only, therefore, does Jesus prohibit murder by the heart or by the mouth or by the hand, but he also says that part of keeping this commandment is being reconciled to your neighbor. So there's both a prohibition in these commandments, but there's also at the same time a requirement to do something. So if you're familiar with Luther's small catechism, in his explanation of these commandments, he'll say something, for instance, like this on this particular commandment. We should fear and love God. So you shall not murder. What does this mean? We should fear and love God so that we do not hurt or harm our neighbor in his body, but help and support him in every physical need. So you have what is prohibited, don't hurt or harm your neighbor in his body, and then you have also what is commandment, but help and support him in every physical need. And we could add to that, also be reconciled to him when he has something against you. All right, so strike one. We certainly haven't kept that commandment. Let's see what Jesus has to say about the commandment with regard to infidelity, with regard to adultery. Are we going to fare any better with that one? Well, let's see. He starts out by saying, you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. Now, before we go any further to see what else he adds, let's take a look at exactly what the Old Testament background of this and the ancient Near Eastern background as well. Because, of course, this comes from Deuteronomy 5 and Exodus 20, the two recordings of the giving of the 10 words, these commandments. And I have some quotes here from various Old Testament scholars, as well from the Theological Dictionary of the Old Testament. So first of all, in the ancient Near East, Israel included, adultery was sometimes called the great sin. So go back to Genesis 20:19, and that's where Abraham withholds the truth from Abimelech that Sarah is his wife, and then Abimelech takes her in, and then when Abimelech finds out, he says to Abraham, you almost made me commit the great sin. So ancient Near Eastern law codes often refer to adultery as the great sin. Idolatry, which is spiritual adultery, is also referred to as the great sin in the Old Testament. Now, from the Theological Dictionary of the Old Testament, the man commits adultery against the woman's husband, not against the woman herself or against his own wife, should he be married. And the woman offends against her husband and their mutual relationship. So adultery is very centered upon what the man does to the husband of the woman that he has committed adultery with. And then this Exodus commentary, Terence Fretheim. Men commit adultery only with married women. Women with any other man. So you see how there's kind of a double standard going on here. In the Old Testament, men commit adultery only with married women, but women with any other man, whether he's married or not. And then also from the Jewish scholar Sarna, from his Exodus commentary, the definition of adultery is sexual intercourse by mutual consent between a married woman and a man who is not her lawful husband. So there was very much in the Old Testament. The reason I set this up is because what we're going to see in just a minute. So there's very much a focus in the Old Testament as well as in the ancient Near East upon the fact that adultery is primarily something that a man does with a married woman. Not just with any woman, but with a married woman. But a married woman with a man who's married or with anyone whatsoever. There's very much a focus upon the wife, in other words, with regard to the way this commandment is actually applied. Now notice what Jesus does. He turns that around and he focuses not just upon what the man does, but what the man even desires to do. So here's how we go from there. You've heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So this is this interiorization and intensification of the law. Jesus is revealing the full ramifications of what God is prohibiting here. So it's not just a married woman sleeping with any man, or not just a married man sleeping with a married woman, but even the desire that a man has to look lustfully at another woman. You've already broken the commandment. Adultery has already been committed in the heart. He goes on to say, if your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out, throw it away. It's better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. If your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one of your members than that your whole body go into hell. Now, we'll come back to the eye being gouged out and the hand cut off in just a minute. What I want to do, first of all, is show you a couple of backgrounds to this kind of language that Jesus uses, both in the Old Testament as well as in some of the Apocrypha. And I take this from a great resource that I turn to on a very regular basis, and that is Intertextual Bible. So you can check that out online. There's just a wealth of information there where you can see how various texts are related to one another in an intertextual sort of way. So I went there, I typed in Matthew 5:28, and this is one of the things that came up. This is from Proverbs 6:25. Do not lust in your heart for her beauty, and do not let her captivate you with her alluring eyes. So, of course, that is paralleling this language that Jesus used about lusting in the heart. And then also, from Sirach, also known as the Wisdom of Jesus ben Sirach or Ecclesiasticus, this is one of the books in the Apocrypha. This is 9, verse 5 and verse 8. Do not look intently at a virgin, or you may stumble and incur penalties for her. So again, this is focused on the eyes. And then verse 8, turn away your eyes from a shapely woman, and do not gaze at her beauty, at beauty belonging to another. Many have been seduced by a woman's beauty, and by it passion is kindled like fire. So those are just a couple examples where Jesus isn't saying something new. That's the reason I wanted you to point those out to you. In Proverbs, as well as in the Wisdom of Jesus ben Sirach, both of which are in the genre of wisdom literature, you have this warning not just against hopping into bed with a woman that you're not married to, but that a woman is married to another man. Certainly that is prohibited, but even more than that, the desire of the heart, the lust of the eyes, both of those. And that then is why Jesus goes on to talk about if your eye causes you to sin, gouge it out, throw it away. Better for you to only have one eye than to go into hell. Or cut off your hand if that causes you to sin. What Jesus is doing is he's as it were, progressing. So your eye sees and lust begins. And then what happens? Well, then your hand moves to touch. So there's kind of a progression here seems to be the idea here. Looking and then touching and then actual physical sexual adultery. Whether this is meant literally or metaphorically, it really doesn't matter. Jesus is saying that nothing is too much to do to prohibit you, to keep you from the breaking of this commandment. Gouge out your eye, cut off your hand. Now, of course, the irony is A blind man can lust. And a man with one hand or no hands whatsoever can still commit adultery. So in the end, what are we left with? We're left really in the same place. So you can't commit physical adultery. That's breaking the commandment. You can't commit adultery with in your heart. You can't commit adultery with your eyes or with your hands. So all the way around, the entirety of your person cannot take one little bitty step toward adultery without you breaking this commandment. So it's not just the people who are engaged in sexual actions with someone that they're not married to that commit adultery. It's even those who desire that. Again, it's the same with the commandment about murder, now with the commandment about adultery. Jesus is saying to each of us, unless you keep this commandment perfectly in thought, word, deed, and desire, then you have broken it. So once more, we are left in the same place. This law condemns us. This law reveals the lustful intents of our heart, and thus this law calls every single one of us adulterers and adulteresses, and thus it calls us to repentance. You see what Jesus is doing here? He's using the law to reveal the full extent of the depravity of our hearts in order to call us to repentance and confession, and thus to forgiveness that we have in Him. Okay, so that's the first couple. Let's go on to see what happens next, and this is about divorce. It was also said, whomever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. All right, let's talk. He has more to say, but let's talk about what this is. First of all, the text to which he's referring is Deuteronomy 24, verses 1 through 4. And the whole thing here is talking about if a man divorces his wife, she goes and marries another man, then he can't remarry her. That's what those 4 verses are about. But I just want you to focus on the first couple. When a man takes a wife and marries her, if then she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, I'm going to explain what that means in a minute, some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, which in Hebrew is a kritut, and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, ... Now, kritut is not the typical Hebrew word for divorce. It comes from the root meaning to cut, karat. And so some scholars think that included with this was some form of like maybe a cutting apart of the robe in order to symbolically show that the marriage itself had been cut, had been severed. But either way, that is the verse, that is the text to which Jesus is referring when he says the writing of a certificate of divorce and is sending her away. Okay, so what is this some indecency? What exactly is Deuteronomy talking about there? Well, there's a whole lot of debate. I mean, you could read for weeks on end the articles, the essays, the books that have been written on this whole subject of marriage and divorce and remarriage and whatnot. Now, let's just briefly look at what the Hebrew has to say. So the phrase that's used here, translated as some indecency, is ervat devar. And that only occurs a couple different times. Once here in Deuteronomy 24:1, but then also in the previous chapter, Deuteronomy 23:15. So this is I have the verses 12 through 14 down there below for you. And this is talking about just kind of how you conduct yourself in a bathroom sort of way in the camp. So you're supposed to have a place outside the camp where you go and you take your trowel, you take a shovel, and then you do your business. You defecate. You dig a hole and you cover it up, because why? The Lord your God walks in the midst of your camp. And you don't want him to see anything indecent, ervat devar, among you and turn away from you. So this seems to be some sort of an exposure of the genitalia is one way to translate this. That would accompany one defecating outside the camp. So when we go back to Deuteronomy 24, we have this same phrase. It's sometimes understood then to be an exposure of the genitalia when he finds some indecency in her. All right? Now, going back to the way this has been understood, there's a whole lot of ways it's translated and also interpreted. Here are just some of the translations of this ervat devar, this indecency. Some indecency, something objectionable, some uncleanness, some shamefully exposed thing, something unmentionable or unpresentable. That's the way the Septuagint just translates it. So, well then, what is it talking about? If he can divorce her for ervat devar, for some blank, Well, how do you understand that? How do you interpret that? You got two basic interpretations. Josephus, Jewish historian, first century. The school of Hillel. Hillel was a famous rabbi, and so those who gathered around him, those who subscribed to his approach with regard to the interpretation of the scriptures, were in his so-called school. And the Rabbi Akiba, who was a famous latter first century, beginning of the second century rabbi, all three of them understood ervat davar to allow divorce for any reason. So this indecency could be anything. It could be, she overcooked a meal, or the husband found someone more desirable, or she just was no longer pleasing to him. Anything. Nothing held back. A Jewish man could divorce his wife for any reason. That's the way they interpreted ervat davar. The school of Shammai, which is more conservative, the school of Shammai, on the other hand, interpreted it to mean sexually indecent behavior or adultery, focusing especially upon the idea that this was an exposure of the genitalia, so they connected that, of course, with some sort of sexual act. So all of that to say that in Jesus' day, you had basically two approaches to this. Some understood that a man could divorce his wife for any reason whatsoever, whatever he wanted. He could send her away with a bill of divorce. And then you had the school of Shammai, which limited that to some sort of sexual indecency, probably adultery. So where does Jesus come down on this? Well, here's what he says. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife except on the ground of sexual immorality makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So Jesus came down in this debate on the same side the school of Shammai came down on. So he understood the Deuteronomy text to refer to some sort of sexual infidelity, and this is often called the exception clause. So no divorce except for that reason. And when he says, if it's not for that, then there's adultery involved afterward. If these two remarry, it's because, according to this interpretation, then they're still married to each other. And so, of course, if they're still married to each other, if they're not divorced because of sexual immorality, then if they go and marry someone else, then adultery has been committed by them because they are still bound to their former spouse. Okay, so that's the commandment about murder. That's the commandment about adultery / divorce. Now we have one more, and that's about oaths. So Jesus goes on to say, again, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. But I say to you, do not take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it's the throne of God, or by the earth, for it's his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it's the city of the great king. And do not take an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything more than this comes from evil. So the background here in the Old Testament is a couple different passages. Leviticus 19:12, you shall not swear by my name falsely, and so profane the name of the Lord. Profane the name of your God. I am the Lord, so don't be using God's name falsely. And Numbers 30, verse 2, if a man vows a vow to the Lord or swears an oath to bind himself by a pledge, he shall not break his word. He shall do according to all that proceeds out of his mouth. So Jesus' words are also then reflected in James 5:12. Above all, my brothers, do not swear either by heaven or by earth or by any other oath, but let your yes be yes and your no be no, so that you may not fall under condemnation. So you might be asking yourself, well, then can we not take oaths at all? Well, the New Testament evidence does not seem to point in the direction of Jesus absolutely prohibiting any oaths whatsoever, because, well, Jesus himself does, as does Paul. We have two instances of this. So if you look at Matthew 26:63, this is when Jesus has been arrested, and the high priest says to him, I adjure you, so I'm putting you under oath, by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. And Jesus does so. He says, you have said so. I tell you, from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. So Jesus, under oath, put under oath by the high priest, answers him. And then also, Paul, 2 Corinthians 1:23, calls upon the name of God. He's swearing upon the name of God. I call God to witness against me. It was to spare you that I refrained from coming again to Corinth. So what seemed to be happening, first of all, that Jesus is saying, by all this talk about heaven or Jerusalem or on your own head, all of this, the emphasis is on the fact that, listen, you always stand in the presence of God. So there's no need to swear by heaven or by Jerusalem or by your head or anything else, because you are always standing in the presence of God. So what you say is heard by him. He's right there. He hears every word. So there's no need to focus upon swearing on heaven or Jerusalem or anything else. Secondly, there seems to be a focus upon kind of the future. So what he's prohibiting is saying, I swear by God that I will blank tomorrow, or I swear by God that I will blank next week. So it seems to be a future orientation here in what Jesus is prohibiting. And then really, ultimately, what he's wanting his disciples to do, what he's wanting all of us to do, is to be so utterly devoted to the truth that no oath is required of us, so that what we say is always the truth. There's no need for me to use God's there's no need for me to use God's name to back up what I have to say, because I am so married to the truth that my word is faithful and true, and it can be relied upon without me, as it were, adding to it by calling upon the name of the God to bear witness that what I'm saying is the truth. So that's a quick run through. I wish we had all the verses to look at, but this has already been a 30-minute video, so it's long enough. Heads up about the next couple weeks. So the next couple weeks there will be no video because I've already done those videos. I would refer you back to that article at 1517.org, where I have an index of all of the various videos that I've done. One will be for Transfiguration, one will be for that first Sunday in Lent, which was about the temptation of Jesus. So I have videos on those, so you can consult that article and you can find those videos there if you're interested to use those for preparation for Sunday. Well, thank you so much for watching. If it's been helpful to you, then be sure and share this with your friends. And I hope that this has been helpful to you as a revealing of the full ramifications of the commandments, as a revealing of how many ways we break these commandments, and then above all, as a call for us to confess and to repent and to come to the Lord our God, who is always ready and willing to forgive us for the sake of Jesus Christ, who has paid the penalty for all our sins by his life, death, and resurrection on our behalf. May the Lord's peace and his mercy and his grace be yours in abundance.